Welcome to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. Today, we take a virtual road trip to a somewhat lesser-known corner of the cheese world, Portugal. Not just in virtual space, but also in time. All across Western Eurasia and North Africa, there are pottery shards with fermented milk residues that emerge in archaeological excavations starting around 5000 BCE in the eastern Mediterranean. By around 4000 BCE, perforated pots or colanders become increasingly common, suggesting that people had figured out how to make not just colloidal dairy products like buttermilk, yogurt, or kefir, but drain curds. Some of these colanders are fairly large. In the Archaeological Museum in Iraklio, Crete, for example, there's a two-tiered setup, which is about 10 inches across. By contrast, the one in the Archaeological Museum in Lisbon, perhaps a few centuries older, is the size and shape of a small vase, perhaps 5 to 6 inches high and about 4 inches across. There's a picture of it in the show notes for this episode. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that the size of a cheese colander or a mold can suggest a number of things about the society that made it. The first thing it likely tells you is what types of dairy animals are most common. Cows give considerably more milk each day than goats, who typically give more than sheep. If you've routinely got a lot of milk to process, you're going to make bigger colanders. Small cheeses are quite common in regions with a lot of sheep and goats. Mold size can also tell you something about land and animal ownership and labor concentration. Lots of large molds or lots of very similar molds in the same location typically indicate either a few very large landowners who control all the resources in the area and centralize production, or a highly collaborative communitarian approach to resources and production. Smaller cheeses are traditionally more common in areas with lots of small, quasi-independent farmers who may only have a few animals and either make cheese solely for their own household or to trade locally with their neighbors. So now let's put our little Copper Age Portuguese strainer together with some other archaeological findings. The Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, arrived some 1500 years later in Portugal than it did in the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Balkan regions, but around the same time as most of the rest of southern Europe. And our little strainer was probably made somewhere between 3 and 2000 BCE. Just as with metalworking technology, Portugal was also at the far end of the expansion of domesticated plants and animals out of the Levant during the late Stone Age or Neolithic Age, and even by the late Copper Age around 2000 BCE, unfortified sites along the Atlantic still contain the remains of mostly wild game. But some people in Portugal and elsewhere in Siberia were starting to build fortified compounds on hilltops between 3 and 2000 BCE. And in these fortified hill sites, the animal bones that people either threw in the trash or reused for other purposes were mostly domesticated animals. So we have two fairly different lifestyles, and possibly different ethnic groups of people living in Portugal in this period. And given that a lot of them felt the need to build walls around their homes and their stuff, it seems likely that there weren't high levels of trust between the two groups. It's certainly likely that there were some small amount of opportunistic exchange between them, but the broader collection of artifacts at these sites indicate growing levels of trade in domesticated animals and manufactured goods across southern Iberia and reaching across to North Africa during this thousand-ish year period. So between fellow sedentary agrarian types, and perhaps not as much of the types of exchanges between nomads and farmers common in Asia from prehistoric into medieval times. At some of these fortified sites, the most numerous animal bones are from sheep and goats, followed by pigs. At others, there are a fair number of cows. An isotope analysis of the cow bones indicates that the cows were traded around between different regions quite a bit. But overall, the number of cows in at least southern Portugal seems to decline relative to sheep and goats as we get closer to 2000 BCE. And so we have a situation that seems to match what our Chalcolithic cheese mold was telling us. Relatively small groups, raising primarily sheep and goats, making small cheeses that could be divvied up easily among 10 or 15 households, or possibly traded on occasion for wild food products, berries, say, or nuts, or animal pelts that decay and wouldn't show up in the town trash heaps 4,000 to 5,000 years later. All right, let's fast forward to today. Hunter-gatherers are, of course, long gone in Portugal, but at least some of the patterns of cheesemaking remain remarkably similar. In the south of the country, the cheeses are generally quite small, 2 to 3 inches in diameter, and mostly sheep milk. In the central portion, as you head north, the cheeses are slightly larger, maybe 4 inches across, with more goat and mixed milk cheeses. Cow milk cheeses do exist. They mostly show up in the north, where Atlantic storms drop rain throughout much of the year, and inland ridges can sometimes be icy in winter. But the large majority of the DOP or protected types of cheeses in Portugal are sheep milk. Portuguese cheeses are pretty different from most other Western European cheeses in how they're made. Almost exactly the opposite of French cheeses in particular, and the results are pretty intriguing. Most of the difference stems from the somewhat unusual ecology of the land, so let's take a look at that for a minute. If you look at a topological map of the country, you'll notice it's a long, thin rectangle sandwiched between the Atlantic Ocean on the west and Spain on the north and east. Except for the southernmost portion, south of Lisbon, it's extremely hilly country. There's a thin strip of flatter land right along the coast where most plant agriculture happens. It's also where the larger cities are and where the main train line in the country runs. But even the major cities on or near the Atlantic, like Lisbon, Porto, Coimbra, are themselves built on several steep hills, and everything gets hillier still as you go inland, especially in the central and northern parts of the country. There are 3 major rivers that come out of the eastern mountains: the Douro in the north, with Porto at its mouth, the Down coming out of the Beira Baixa region in the central region, and merging with the Mondego River above Coimbra, and the Tejo or Tagus River that runs past Lisbon. Tourist brochures often talk of Portugal's Mediterranean climate, mainly because it gets heat waves periodically coming up from Africa. But these are moderated by the cool, moist air of the Atlantic, and the coastal regions typically get 2 to 3 inches of rain 9 months out of the year. Inland, it's another story. Because the hills closer to the coast catch much of the oceanic moisture, you don't have to get very far inland before things become extremely dry, especially in the hot summer months when it's routinely around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 39 to 40 degrees Celsius. So except right within the relatively steep river valleys, where wine is typically grown, much of the interior of the country is dry scrubland, mostly given over to livestock agriculture, especially animals that will happily eat bushes and thistles, like sheep and goats. So speaking of thistles, there are a lot of them, and this is the heart of Portuguese cheesemaking. One of the thistles that grows wild all over the dry eastern hills, both on the Portuguese side of the border and on the Spanish side in what's known as the Extremadura, is the cardoon, which is the original wild cultivar of the plant, more often recognized as the artichoke. And the head of the cardoon thistle looks a lot like a small artichoke. If you let it flower, you'll get a whole head of little purple needles. Shear these needles off, soak them in water for a day or two, and you have a type of rennet, a plant rennet rather than an animal one. So back in episode 2, I talked a bit about rennets. These are the enzymes that cause milk to coagulate into a sliceable gel. They're not always used in cheesemaking, especially outside of Europe, but within Europe, rennet cheeses are the most common type. However, animal rennets require killing animals when they're still quite young and small, before they start eating solid foods. And that means you're not going to get much meat from the animal you slaughter. In regions with plenty of water and sources of plant food for both animals and humans, this is somewhat less of an issue. But in these very dry, sparsely populated regions, where both herds and human groups are small, and it's difficult because of the steep terrain to transport food from elsewhere, it probably traditionally made more economic sense for most herders to grow their animals to full size before slaughtering them, and use the abundant cardoons for their cheese. So the majority of the DOP cheeses in Portugal are made from cardoon rennet. This is also true in the Extremadura and mountainous northern regions of Spain, though elsewhere on the Spanish plains they mostly use animal rennet. Cardoon rennet differs from animal rennet in how it behaves over time. With animal rennet, the enzymes coagulate the milk quickly, but then also become inactive fairly quickly as it finishes eating through the protein structures of the liquid milk. Cardoon rennet, on the other hand, works much more slowly, but also doesn't stop working as the cheese ages. So where animal rennet cheeses primarily age thanks to the slow work of the cultures and the cheese breaking down fats and proteins, cardoon cheeses age relatively quickly. And in some ways, you could say that they age from the inside out. One of the first cheeses I was introduced to upon arriving in Portugal last month was a little sheep cheese called azeitão. from the region just south of Lisbon. It's perhaps 2.5 inches or 5 centimeters across and served at either room temperature or just slightly warmed with the top cut off so you can scoop out the soft, gooey interior and spread it on bread. The rind is surprisingly thick given the size of the cheese. It's a good 1/4 inch or so. So it provides a sturdy container for the paste. But the rind is also chewy, not hard and waxy like on an aged natural rind cheese. And I couldn't figure out how they got this combination of gooey center and thick, chewy rind. See, in other parts of Europe, like France and Italy, cheeses with gooey centers are what we call surface-ripened cheeses. They're also small, often fairly flat, because the yeasts and molds that are encouraged to grow on the surface of the cheese progressively work their way into the center of the cheese, breaking down the proteins as they go. So you want a flat cheese so that the distance from the surface to the center isn't very big. But those rinds are typically very thin. Sometimes they have that white fuzz coat on them like Brie or Valençay. Other times the surface is washed regularly with brine containing bee linen scores, and it gets that slightly tacky orange surface that sometimes smells like dirty socks or feet. Often these types of cheeses will be aged in warm, very moist environments, so like mid-50s to low 60s Fahrenheit or 14 to 18 Celsius and 90 to 95% humidity for the first week or two of their lives to encourage those yeasts and molds to get their foothold on the surface of the cheese. And then once they grow in, the cheese is moved to a cold location like a regular fridge at or below 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 Celsius to slow down the surface aging and bring it in line with the pace of the resident cultures in the cheese. Most of those cheeses are also pretty high moisture cheeses that retain a fair amount of the sugary whey, with delicate, barely cooked curds that are only very lightly pressed or not pressed at all. And the lactose-heavy moisture in the curds contributes to the growth of the surface flora, as well as the more rapid breakdown of the proteins, because the lactic cultures have the food and moisture they need to be lively. But we don't have any of that going on here with the Portuguese cheeses. In fact, virtually all of the cheeses I found anywhere in the country had scrupulously mold-free rinds. So what was going on here? It turns out that these younger, smaller cheeses, they do almost the opposite of how young gooey cheeses are made elsewhere in Europe. After cutting and draining the curds, which are relatively dry, they knead them for a bit in the draining bag to get out even more moisture, and then they pack them into forms. So the curds are individually wrung out and also cooled to room temperature before they're ever packed together, and they're not packed hard. They're left in their molds in a moist, cold room for 2 to 3 days, still 90 to 95% humidity, but 4 to 6 degrees C or low 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they're either scrubbed down with a strong brine and whey solution or else rubbed down with dry salt. So during this cold aging time, a rind starts to form and lactose continues to be converted to lactic acid, but all of it very slowly because the temperature is so far below the culture's happy active range. After these first few cold days and a thorough salting and scrubbing, the cheeses then move to a warmer and slightly drier area, so 12 to 14 C or low 50s Fahrenheit, and 80 to 85% humidity, which is the same sort of environment most other cheeses age in. So the rind continues to develop, but anything that was growing on the surface of the cheese initially has been ruthlessly destroyed, and it will continue to be scrubbed off if anything attempts to start something over the remainder of the aging time. Meanwhile, the cardoon rennet is still working to break down proteins inside the cheese. So these smallest and youngest cheeses age for only about 20 days in all. Slightly larger cheeses are sometimes aged longer, 40 days for medium hardness and piquancy, up to 3 months for very hard piquant cheeses. But none are sharp in the sense that we might think of a cheddar being sharp, and the lack of other yeasts and molds means that the cheeses taste deeply of milk. You taste the character of the milk, and to some degree its pasture. So it's mild and rich and sweet in the younger cheeses, caramely and slightly nutty in the quote-unquote medio cheeses, tangy and gamey in the hardest, driest ones. A cheese board in Portugal tends to be a study in age and texture contrasts rather than the mold or culture-induced flavor variety that's more common in places like France and Italy. It's a philosophy that's very natural in the context of Portuguese cuisine as a whole, which tends to be simple and straightforward. Lots of grilling and boiling, the seasoning leaning most heavily on olive oil, salt, and vinegar. So you might be wondering at this point, why are Portuguese cheeses relatively rare in North American supermarkets? Why isn't Serra da Estrela routinely sitting next to your President Brie and Cabot cheddar? The first answer is scale of production. Portugal's a small country, and its mainland cheeses mostly come from animals, sheep and goats, that don't produce huge volumes of milk. The second answer has to do with the age of the cheese. Virtually all of Portugal's 16 DOP cheeses are made from raw milk, and those that are served young are well under that magical 60 days the US FDA likes. And because most of the mainland ones are sheep cheeses, and sheep dairies are vanishingly rare in North America, we don't have many American-made renditions either. There are certainly longer-aged, hard cheeses in Portugal, especially from the Alentejo region in the southeast. Évora and Paprika Rub Nisa are two such examples. And there are Amarelo from the Beira Baixa in the central east and Transmontano goat cheese in the northeast. The reason that I started adding that mainland caveat a few minutes ago is because there's quite a renowned cow milk cheese called São Jorge, made in the Azores, which are a group of Portuguese islands in the central Atlantic. São Jorge is a hard, sharp, crumbly cheese, aged a minimum of 30 days, but usually much longer, more like 90 or more. And because many of the Portuguese who moved abroad, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, were from the Azores, there are several domestic renditions of São Jorge cheese in North America. Here in Northern California, the Matos family makes an excellent São Jorge on their farm outside of Santa Rosa. If you happen to live in an area with a Portuguese community and Portuguese markets, you will likely find some Portuguese cheeses there. Otherwise, several online retailers carry the more aged options. I'll include a link to a list of the more popular Portuguese cheeses to look for in the show notes. Next time we'll delve into bloomy rind cheeses. Turns out there's a lot more to that world beyond brie and camembert. We'll talk mixed milk bloomies and stabilized pastes and what to look for when you go shopping. So join me again next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.